Grace and George had been together for over 20 years. Their marriage seemed strong and stable, but the years have changed their relationship. At the beginning of their life together, everything was filled with passion and love. They traveled, often had dinners with friends, and enjoyed life. However, over the years, their communication was reduced to mundane things. They discussed household chores, work, problems with bills, but the emotional intimacy began to fade. It all started gradually. Grace didn't even notice how at one point their conversations became shallow. They had dinner together every night, but they only talked about what they needed to do next week: buy groceries, pay bills, do repairs. Their evenings together were increasingly spent in silence. George was sitting on the couch with a tablet or a newspaper, and Grace was trying to find solace in books or television shows. Sometimes they exchanged a few words, but these conversations were far from the deep conversations they enjoyed in their youth.
George, can you pick up the car from the repair tomorrow?
George nodded without taking his eyes off the TV screen.
Yes, I'll pick her up on the way home from work, and don't forget to buy milk. We're out of milk.
These short exchanges have become typical of their interactions. Grace often thought that they were missing something important: the spark, the emotional intimacy they once had. She noticed how the distance between them was growing. Although physically they remained close, George was always caring and devoted, but over the years their relationship became so routine that Grace began to feel lonely, even being in his presence. She often sat in the kitchen in the evenings, staring into a cup of tea, wondering where the emotions they once felt for each other had gone. It occurred to her that maybe they had just become old. But in her heart, she understood that it wasn't just age, something had really changed. One evening, after a particularly long and silent dinner, Grace decided to talk to George. She couldn't hold back her emotions anymore.
George, we haven't talked to each other for a long time. I don't mean talking about bills or repairs, I mean us. What do you think is going on?
George looked at her in surprise, as if he didn't fully understand the question.
What do you mean? We talk every day. We are together. We're fine, aren't we?
Grace felt a wave of disappointment rise in her chest. She didn't want to talk to George that way, but the words came out of her mouth.
Do you really think so? After all, we hardly communicate. We live together, but do you notice that we have become strangers? We don't talk about feelings anymore, about us. It all comes down to routine.
George paused, wondering what to say. He hadn't expected this turn of conversation. There was some puzzlement and concern in his eyes.
Grace, I'm working. I'm trying to make sure we have everything we need. You know that I'm always there if you need me. It's just that I have a lot to do right now.
But Grace felt that this excuse could no longer satisfy her. She knew that it wasn't just his busy schedule, but that they had lost something important.
I know that you work and take care of us, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about us, George, that we no longer have the connection that we had before. I feel lonely even when you're around.
George fell silent. He wasn't ready for such a confession. Deep down, he may have realized that their relationship had changed, but he never thought about it out loud. He was used to calmness, to stability, and did not think about the fact that Grace might feel differently. After that night, their conversations became even less frequent. George began to avoid such topics, thinking that over time everything would get better by itself. But Grace spent more and more evenings alone, feeling their marriage gradually fade away. She tried to find something to do that could distract her from thoughts of a failed relationship, but none of them brought relief. Grace tried to diversify their daily lives by offering to spend the weekend together, go to some new place, as they did in their youth, but George almost always refused, citing fatigue or work matters. She saw him gradually closing himself off from her, and it hurt her. One evening, when George was working late again, Grace was sitting in the bedroom looking at their wedding photo on the bedside table. She remembered that day how happy they were, full of hope for the future. Then it seemed that their love was eternal, that it would withstand any test. But now Grace wasn't so sure. Her soul ached from the realization that her marriage no longer brought her joy. She was increasingly thinking about what deserved more warmth, understanding, emotional intimacy. But she didn't know how to bring it all back into their relationship. It seemed to her that George no longer saw in her the woman he had once fallen in love with. A few months later, when their relationship had not changed, Grace began to notice that she was increasingly distancing herself from George. She continued to fulfill her duties as a wife, but inside she felt increasingly alienated. She couldn't bring herself to feel the closeness they had before again. One evening, when they were having dinner in silence again, Grace decided to have another frank conversation.
George, I can't pretend that everything is okay anymore. It's hard for me. I don't feel like a part of this marriage anymore.
George, tired after work, looked at her anxiously.
What do you want to say, Grace? Do you want to leave?
Grace shook her head, not knowing how to properly express her feelings.
No, I don't want to leave. I want us to change something so that we can get closer again. But I don't know how to do it anymore.
George sighed, feeling the weight of her words. He finally realized that their problems were deeper than he thought. He understood that something had really changed, but it was hard for him to accept it.
I do not know how to fix this, Grace. I always thought that everything was fine with us. Maybe we just need more time.
Grace felt that she had reached a dead end again. She didn't know how to explain to George that time wouldn't solve their problems. She wanted to change. She wanted to feel loved and needed, but her husband couldn't give her that. After this conversation, Grace finally realized that their marriage might not be able to return to its previous state. Her thoughts began to return more and more often to the fact that she deserves more than just living together without a Jim. It was hard for her to accept this, but she couldn't ignore her feelings anymore. She realized that she was on the verge of making an important decision, but she did not yet know what it would be. Grace did not want to destroy her marriage, but she could no longer live in a world where her heart was empty. Her soul demanded changes, and she felt that these changes were just around the corner. When Grace's daughter, Erica, announced her wedding to Malik, it became a highlight in the life of the whole family. Grace, despite the personal difficulties in her marriage to George, was happy for her daughter. Erica and Malik looked perfect, young, energetic, full of plans for the future. Grace noticed that her own life looked dull and devoid of passion in comparison, but she did not allow herself to complain. All the attention should have been on the wedding, not on her inner feelings. The wedding was great. All the guests were happy, and the young couple was glowing with happiness. Grace tried to enjoy the moment, but all the time she felt a shadow of loneliness. Even in the midst of all these celebrations, her marriage to George was in the background of her thoughts. It was a marriage that had long lost its meaning and depth. The first meeting with Malik was typical for this kind of event, a short exchange of greetings, formal conversations about how the evening went, what plans for the future. Malik looked confident and charismatic, which immediately caught Grace's eye. He was polite, smiling, and always ready to offer help. He seemed to her to be a real gentleman who respected not only his new wife, but also her parents.
Grace, you look amazing today. Erica said that you have wonderful taste, and now I see why.
Grace smiled, feeling a little warmth from the compliment, but didn't think much of it.
Thank you, Malik. I am glad that Erica has found such a caring and kind husband. You're perfect for each other.
With that, their conversation ended, and Grace returned to her seat at the table. She was happy for her daughter, but something inside her was worried. Malik was someone she hadn't seen in her husband George for many years young, full of energy and life. Grace couldn't help but wonder how different his attitude towards Erica was from what had happened between her and George. Malik's attention to Erica, his care and tenderness reminded Grace of the days when George was the same. A few weeks have passed since the wedding, and the newlyweds have begun their family journey. Malik and Erica often came to visit Grace's parents. George, as usual, was busy with his own affairs and practically did not pay attention to what was happening around him. But Malik always found time to talk to Grace, find out how she was doing, help with something around the house. These were small things, but Grace noticed how pleased she was with his attention. One day, when Erica was busy at work, Malik stopped by Grace's place to help her with the renovation in the living room, which she mentioned earlier. George was at work, as always. It was an ordinary weekday, unremarkable, but for Grace, this moment was a turning point.
Grace, didn't you say you needed help moving furniture? I'm free right now. I can do it if you want.
Oh, Malik, thank you. That would be great. George is busy all the time. I didn't think I could handle it anymore.
Malik began to move the furniture, and Grace watched him gratefully. He was young, strong, and seemed full of energy. It contrasted with the tiredness and indifference she saw in George. Every time Malik helped her, Grace felt needed, which was a long-forgotten feeling for her. After all the work was done, Malik offered to drink tea. They sat down in the kitchen, and the conversation, which began as an ordinary exchange of pleasantries, suddenly turned into something deeper.
You know, Grace, I've always admired the way you handle everything. Erica said that you are a strong woman, and I can see it for myself.
Grace blushed at his words. It had been nice to hear such compliments for a long time, especially from someone who was so young and full of life.
Thank you, Malik. But to be honest, lately I feel like I'm losing that power.
He looked at her in surprise, trying to figure out what she meant.
What do you mean? You seem so confident to me.
Grace sighed, feeling her long hidden emotions coming to the surface.
It's just that everything changes with age. George and me, we became like neighbors, not like husband and wife. I know he cares about me, but our relationship hasn't been the same for a long time.
Malik listened attentively without interrupting her. His gaze was full of sympathy.
I understand how hard it is, but I think you deserve more, Grace. You should feel loved and needed.
Those words struck a chord with her. Grace hadn't expected such frankness from Malik, but his words resonated with her own thoughts. She didn't know how to react, but suddenly she felt something inside her start to come alive. He was saying what she was afraid to admit herself, that she deserved more than just to exist within the framework of her usual life. After this conversation, their meetings began to occur more often. Malik still came to help with the small chores around the house, but now there was more between them. They talked for hours, discussing life, feelings, dreams. Grace began to notice that every time Malik left, she looked forward to the next meeting with impatience. She began to feel an affection for him that she hadn't felt for George in a long time. It's been a few months since Grace and Malik started spending more time together. He became for her not just a son-in-law, but someone who understood her on a deeper level. She couldn't help but think how different he was from George. With Malik, she felt alive, needed, and interesting again. He was the one she had been looking for a long time, the one who reminded her again that she was a woman, not just a housewife and a mother. But Grace couldn't ignore the guilt that was beginning to creep into her thoughts. She understood that her feelings for Malik went beyond what was allowed, that she was cheating not only on George, but also betraying her daughter. But every day her attraction to him grew stronger. She tried to fight with herself, but her heart pulled her towards him. One day, when they were alone again, Grace couldn't stand it.
Malik, I can't pretend there's nothing between us anymore. I feel like this is wrong, but I can't stop.
Malik looked at her with a serious expression on his face. He knew that this moment would come, but he couldn't hide his feelings anymore either.
Grace, I feel the same way. I've tried to fight it, but I can't deny what's going on. You've become more important to me than I could have imagined.
They both realized that their bond had become more than just friendship or sympathy. It was a real emotional and physical vector that they could no longer ignore. After their conversations began to become more and more open, Grace began to notice that her attitude towards Malika had changed. Previously, he was just her son-in-law, the young husband of her daughter, but now she saw something more in him. Their conversations went beyond formal discussions, and Grace began to discover a man who was full of vitality, attentiveness, and caring qualities that she had not felt in her relationship with George for a long time. Every time Malik came to help around the house or just drop in for tea, their conversations started to get deeper. Grace felt that she could be sincere around him, that she didn't have to hide her emotions or worries. He listened to her with the kind of attention she hadn't received from her husband in a long time. Malik, in turn, also shared his feelings and thoughts with her. One day, after a long day, when George was late at work again, Malik came to help fix the lock on the door. Grace invited him to stay for dinner, as Erica was also busy and couldn't come. This evening was a turning point in their relationship.
Malik, I do not know how we would have coped without your help. You always come to the rescue when George is busy.
Malik smiled as he pushed his plate away after dinner.
It's not a problem for me. You and George are family, and I'm always happy to help. And to be honest, I like coming here. It's kind of cozy here.
Grace felt the warmth of his words. She couldn't help but notice that Malik was more attentive to her words and mood than her own husband. He was always ready to support her, give her advice, or just listen to her.
Sometimes I think you shouldn't waste your time helping us so much. You have your own life, youth. But thanks anyway.
Don't say that, Grace. I really like being around. You're an amazing woman. You know how to listen and always find the right words. You're easy.
These words touched her more deeply than she expected. She hadn't heard such compliments in a long time. The young man who was sitting opposite admired her, and it made her feel alive. She noticed how his eyes glittered when he spoke to her. It was more than just politeness, there was something sincere, elusive in his gaze. Gradually, the conversation turned to personal topics. Malik began to tell Grace about his life before marrying Erica, about how he sometimes feels lonely in his relationship. Despite their love for Erica, they also had difficulties. Malik felt that his young wife was too immersed in her career and did not always notice his needs.
You know, sometimes I feel like I don't get enough attention. Erica is so busy with her career. Don't get me wrong, I'm proud of her, but sometimes I feel like I'm not in the first place.
Grace understood his feeling. She had experienced something similar with her husband. A response to his words appeared in her soul, and they began to speak more openly.
I understand you. George was also very focused on his work and business. It seems to me that he and I seem to live in parallel worlds, and our paths almost do not intersect. We stopped being a team a long time ago.
Malik nodded, listening intently. He saw the sadness in Grace's eyes and wanted to comfort her. He understood that her words were riddled with the pain of loneliness and the loss of those feelings that had once been in her life. They continued to talk about their shared experiences, and at that moment a real emotional connection arose between them. Each understood that the other was experiencing similar feelings. After that evening, their relationship began to develop even more rapidly. Malik increasingly found reasons to stop by Grace's place, even if it was simple little things, to help fix something in the house or bring groceries. He always found time to stay longer, and each time their conversations became more personal. Grace began to realize that her attraction to Malika was getting stronger. Malik began to realize that he was pleased to be with Grace, not only because of her wisdom and support, but also because she made him feel needed. In her company, he felt a calmness that he rarely experienced even with Erica. Grace felt young and alive next to him. Every time Malik looked at her or touched her hand by accident, she found herself thinking that feelings were awakening inside her that she had not experienced for a long time. It was unusual and exciting. She knew it was wrong, that she shouldn't feel that way about her son-in-law, but her heart told her otherwise. One day, when they were sitting in the backyard watching the sunset, Grace couldn't stand it and confessed what she had been feeling for a long time.
Malik, I can't keep quiet anymore. It seems to me that something is going on between us, and I do not know how to feel about it.
Malik looked at her with a serious expression on his face. He felt the same way, but he didn't know how to express his thoughts correctly.
Grace, I feel it too. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't. You are more to me than just Erica's mom.
These words hung in the air. Both were aware that they had crossed the border, but neither of them wanted to back down. Their attraction to each other had become too strong to ignore. Grace knew their relationship couldn't go on like this, but she couldn't stop. In the following days, they continued to communicate, but now there was tension in their relationship. Both understood that they were pulling each other into the forbidden. Every time they met, their communication became more intimate and emotionally intense. Grace couldn't deny that Malik had become an important part of her life. He was the one who gave her back her sense of need and importance. One day, when they were alone in the house again, Grace realized that she could no longer hide her feelings. It was hard for her to live with this internal struggle. She couldn't pretend anymore that her attraction to Malika was just a passing infatuation. It was more than that. It was something she had been missing for many years: emotional intimacy and sincere attention. Malik, for his part, could no longer ignore his feelings for Grace. She became for him not just the mother of his wife, but a woman who understood him and with whom he could be himself. He appreciated her wisdom, kindness, and the warmth she radiated.
Grace, I know it's difficult, but I can't hide my feelings anymore. You've become an important part of my life, and I don't want to lose that.
Grace looked at him, feeling her heart constrict with fear and joy at the same time. She knew their relationship was wrong, but her attraction to Malika was too strong to ignore. She couldn't bring herself to push him away, even though she knew she had to.
Malik, I can't pretend anymore either. But what are we going to do? This is not right. We have to stop before we go too far.
Malik nodded, understanding her doubts, but was not ready to back down. He came closer, their eyes met, and at that moment everything was said between them without words. Grace and Malik, continuing their frequent meetings, gradually began to realize that their communication had crossed the boundaries of what was acceptable. The tone of their conversations became more and more intimate, and the emotional intimacy intensified. There was something going on between them that both of them couldn't ignore: passion and attraction. They were aware that these feelings were misdirected, that they were both violating moral and family boundaries, but their bond was getting stronger every day. Every time Malik came to the house where Grace lived, there was tension between them, which both tried to hide. They tried to continue their conversations as before, staying within the framework of formal communication, but it became increasingly difficult for them. Their gazes met more often than before, and every time their hands accidentally touched each other, they felt a flash of emotion that was hard to ignore. Grace, despite her realization that this was wrong, couldn't stop thinking about Malik. He became a source of joy and comfort for her, which she had not received for many years. For Grace, Malik was the one who gave her a sense of vitality that had long since faded in her marriage to George. She had long since come to terms with the fact that her family life had become a routine in which there was no place for passion and sincerity. Malik was the exact opposite of George. He was young, full of energy and sincere interest in her life. He looked at her with respect and attention, which Grace had not felt from her husband for a long time. It made her feel needed and important again. For Malik, Grace was not just his wife's mother, but a woman who understood him on a deep emotional level. He saw her as a wise, strong person, able to listen and support, which contrasted with the relationship he had with Erica. There was a cold distance in their marriage, as Erica was completely absorbed in her career, and she had almost no time for a relationship. Malik felt that his emotions and feelings remained unanswered, but next to Grace he found understanding and warmth, which he missed so much. One day everything changed. One day, when George was at work and Erica was late with another business meeting, Malik came back to Grace to help with chores. But this time it was different. Their communication, which always started with simple conversations about life, quickly turned to more personal topics. Grace noticed how strongly she was attracted to Malika, and her fears that they might cross the border began to recede before the growing attraction. When Malik and Grace met eyes at that moment, they both realized that their bond could no longer remain within the framework of an ordinary friendship. Everything that they had been holding back inside themselves for the past months suddenly spilled out. Their physical attraction, which they had suppressed for so long, became impossible to control. The moment they got close to each other, all moral constraints collapsed. It was the point of no return. Their first intimacy happened unexpectedly and became not only a physical but also an emotional release for both of them. It was a moment when they both allowed themselves to forget about reality, forget about what they were doing, and just follow their feelings. Grace felt alive at that moment, full of emotions she hadn't felt in a long time. It was something she had been missing for many years in her marriage to George. After that moment, their relationship changed. Grace and Malik could no longer pretend that nothing was going on between them. Now it was a real romance, secret, filled with passion and danger. Every time they met, their relationship grew deeper. They were looking for ways to spend time together, hiding their feelings from others. Their meetings became more and more frequent, but each of them was surrounded by the fear of exposure. Grace knew that what she was doing would betray not only her husband, but also her daughter. But she couldn't give up on Malik. He had become too important to her. His presence in her life had become irreplaceable. She couldn't imagine being alone again, returning to the routine of her marriage, in which there was neither passion nor sincerity. Malik was for her the one who gave her a new meaning in life, the one who made her feel like a woman again. Malik, despite his feelings of guilt towards Erica, also could not end this relationship. He knew he was betraying his wife, but his feelings for Grace were too strong. She became for him the person next to whom he could be himself, the one who understood him best. Their meetings became not just a way to escape from reality, but a way to find yourself. They both understood that their affair could not last forever, that sooner or later they would be discovered. But every time they met, their attraction became stronger than the fear of exposure. The mystery of their relationship added a special poignancy to their every moment together. They enjoyed every moment, knowing that it could end at any second. Grace and Malik tried to meet in secret. They chose moments when George and Erica were busy to spend a few hours together. Sometimes it was meetings at her house when George was at work. Sometimes they went out of town to spend time away from everyone. These meetings were full of passion, but also pain, because each time they realized that sooner or later their relationship would become known. Every time they returned to their normal lives, they had to hide their true feelings. Grace continued to live with George, fulfilling her duties, but her thoughts were only about Malik. It was getting harder and harder for her to pretend that everything was okay. Her soul was in chaos. She knew she was destroying her family, but she couldn't give up on Malik. She knew that this relationship couldn't last forever, but she couldn't bring herself to end it. Malik also lived in a state of constant stress. He had to hide his feelings for Grace while continuing to build the appearance of a normal relationship with Erica. But his soul was divided into two parts. On the one hand, he loved Erica, but on the other hand, he was attracted to Grace. It was becoming more and more difficult for him to hide his feelings, and every day the fear of exposure grew. They both knew that their romance had already gone too far, and that the consequences would be inevitable. But every time they met, everything else stopped mattering. They enjoyed the moments they spent together, despite the realization that at some point they would have to face reality. Their attraction grew stronger every day. Grace and Malik couldn't ignore their feelings anymore. Their secret affair had become an integral part of their lives, and they didn't know how to stop this process. They continued to meet in secret, hiding their relationship from everyone, but they understood that it could not last forever. At some point, Grace began to wonder what would happen next. Her guilt was getting stronger. She realized that she was betraying not only George, but also her daughter. But every time she met Malik, she only strengthened her attraction to him. She couldn't stop, even if she knew it would lead to devastating consequences. Malik also felt on edge. He knew he was destroying his family, but his feelings for Grace were too strong to ignore. He could no longer continue to live in constant deception. But he did not know how to end this relationship. Every time they met, he felt that this might be their last meeting, but he couldn't give it up. They both lived in a state of constant stress and fear of exposure, but that didn't stop them. Their romance continued despite all the internal conflicts and the realization that sooner or later their secret would be revealed. Over time, as the relationship between Grace and Malik deepened, Grace became more and more consumed by guilt. She became increasingly aware of the seriousness of what had happened between her and her daughter's husband. Every time she was alone in the silence of her house, thoughts of the consequences of her actions returned to her. The weight of this mystery was becoming more and more unbearable. At first glance, her affair with Malik seemed to be something that gave her the joy she had lost in her routine life with George. But now the joy was increasingly replaced by feelings of guilt and fear. Grace tried to keep her outward calm, but her thoughts kept returning to Malik and their relationship. She couldn't deny that her attraction to him was too strong to just end everything. With each meeting, her heart was beating faster and her feelings were becoming more confused. It had been a long time since she had felt such passion as with Malik, but she understood that this fire was devouring her from the inside. She realized that she had betrayed not only George, who had always been her mainstay, but also her daughter Erica. Every time Erica came to visit or called, Grace felt her heart tighten. Conversations with my daughter, which used to bring joy, have now become a source of pain. It seemed to her that Erica could guess her secret just by looking at her. Deep down, Grace knew that one day she would have to tell the truth, but she was afraid of this moment. Erica has always been her pride, her daughter, to whom she wanted to convey the best in life. Now Grace has betrayed her in the most terrible way, violating the boundaries of the family. Malik, in turn, was also under pressure. It was hard for him to hide his feelings for Grace, because with each meeting he realized that his emotions were not fleeting. He became genuinely attached to her, but his love for Erica haunted him. He loved his wife despite the difficulties in the relationship and did not want to destroy his marriage. However, the attraction to Grace was too strong to just stop seeing her. Every time they were alone, Malik forgot about everything. But upon returning home, he had to face reality. Every encounter with Grace became a source of both pleasure and suffering. In those moments when they were together, Malik felt like he was living life to the fullest. He could be himself next to Grace, talking about his feelings, fears and desires. She understood him like no one else. But every time after the meeting, he had to return home to Erica, keeping the mask of ordinary life on his face. He began to feel like he was being torn apart. On the one hand, he didn't want to betray Erica. On the other hand, he couldn't give up on Grace. Over time, the fear of exposure began to engulf Malik as well. He understood that their secret romance could not last forever. The more they dated, the more the threat of someone finding out about their relationship grew. Malik began to notice the smallest details that could betray their connection. He was afraid of casual encounters, suspicious glances and conversations in which someone might notice their excessive closeness. This fear became his constant companion. Grace also began to fear that someone around her might notice her changes. Her inner state influenced her behavior. She tried to hide her anxiety, but every time George or Erica paid attention to her, she was overcome with fear. It seemed to her that they could feel her guilt, that her every word, every look betrayed her secret. Grace could no longer live in peace in her house. She felt trapped by her own actions. Relations with George became increasingly strained. Grace could spend less and less time with him without feeling a nagging sense of guilt. She saw how he was getting older, how his arms were getting weaker, how his face was wrinkled. She knew that George had always been faithful to her, and this made her guilt even more severe. But despite this, her attraction to Malika was stronger. She tried to maintain the semblance of a normal life, but a hurricane of emotions raged inside her that could not be controlled. Malik also felt that his life was divided into two parts. On the one hand, he continued to be a caring husband and partner for Erica, but on the other hand, his soul belonged to Grace. Each meeting with her brought joy and satisfaction, but after that followed a long streak of regret and fear. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to remain calm around Erica. He knew that he couldn't hide his feelings indefinitely. Malik began to fear not only for his future with Erica, but also for the whole family. He knew that if their affair was discovered, it would destroy not only his marriage, but also the entire family structure. They both understood that their relationship was on the verge. Each of their meetings was imbued with a sense of danger. Grace and Malik were afraid that someone might see them, that the truth would become known. Their romance turned into a constant tension that threatened to explode at any moment. Grace began to wonder more and more often how long they could continue in the same spirit. She knew that sooner or later everything would become known, and this fear became an integral part of her life. Grace couldn't sleep at night. She tossed and turned in bed next to George, thinking about Malik. Her thoughts raced from memories of recent meetings to fear of the future. She knew she couldn't live with this burden of guilt forever, but it was too hard for her to break up with Malik. Every morning began with a promise to herself to end this affair, but every time she saw Malik, her resolve crumbled. He became a drug for her, which it is impossible to give up. Malik also woke up more and more often at night with a heavy heart. He knew that he was doing the wrong thing, that he was betraying not only his wife, but also the whole family. But his passion for Grace was too strong. He tried to think of ways to end this affair, but each time he was drawn back to Grace. He knew that if their relationship continued, it would lead to disaster, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. With each passing day, their fear of exposure grew stronger. They began to avoid unnecessary glances, meeting in the most secluded places where no one could see them. They knew that the slightest mistake could cost them everything, but even so, they couldn't stop. Their meetings became more intense, but also more passionate. They lived in constant fear of the truth becoming known, but they couldn't give up on each other. At some point, Grace began to feel that her soul could not stand the strain. She cried more and more often alone, thinking about what she had done. She felt like a monster who had betrayed everyone she loved. But despite this, her feelings for Malika were too strong to just stop them. She began to wonder how they could live on if everything was revealed. But every time she thought about it, she was terrified. She was afraid of losing everything: her family, the respect of her loved ones, even her self-esteem. Malik also began to think more and more about what would happen next. He understood that their romance could not last forever, and this scared him. He began to notice that Erica had become more attentive to him, that she was increasingly asking questions about where he had been and what he had been doing. Malik knew she was feeling something, but he still didn't understand what it was. He was afraid of the moment when the truth would come out. This fear became his constant companion. Grace and Malik both knew they were on the edge. Their feelings grew stronger, but their fears grew with them. They both knew that exposure was inevitable, and this turned their meetings into a source of not only passion, but also torment. The revelation of Grace and Malik's affair became inevitable, as they both had anticipated. The secret that they had kept so long and carefully had finally come out. Their relationship, filled with passion, forbidden attraction, and fear of exposure, led to the destruction of many people's lives, and the consequences were devastating. It all started with one random event that put an end to their secret relationship. It was an ordinary day when it would seem nothing foreshadowed trouble. Malik and Grace met once again on one of their secret dates. Their meetings were always held away from the eyes of the family, in secluded places where no one could see them. But this time fate played a cruel joke on them. At some point, someone familiar with the family accidentally noticed them together and did not keep it a secret. Soon, rumors that the mother-in-law and son-in-law were having an affair began to spread among friends and acquaintances. Erica, as expected, found herself at the epicenter of these rumors. She heard talk that her husband and her mother were dating behind her back. Initially, she couldn't believe it. The idea that her own mother would betray her in such a way seemed too absurd. But the more Erica began to notice oddities in the behavior of Malik and Grace, the stronger her suspicions became. Erica, as expected, found herself at the epicenter of these rumors. She heard talk that her husband and her mother were dating behind her back. Initially, she couldn't believe it. The idea that her own mother would betray her in such a way seemed too absurd. But the more Erica began to notice oddities in the behavior of Malik and Grace, the stronger her suspicions became. She began to recall moments that she hadn't previously attached importance to: casual glances, too long communication at family events, secretive conversations that seemed to be filled with something more than just friendships. All these details formed into one picture, which began to take real shape. Erica decided to find out the truth and began to monitor the behavior of Malik and Grace. She became more attentive, looked closely at their interaction, tried to catch Erica decided to find out the truth, and began to monitor the behavior of Malik and Grace. She became more attentive, looked closely at their interaction, tried to catch every hint that her suspicions might be true. And at some point, unable to stand it, she interrogated Malik, demanding an explanation. He tried to get out of it, denied everything, but his lies were too obvious. Erica knew that Malik was hiding something, and her confidence in his betrayal grew every day. Finally, one day, Erica set up an ambush. She saw Malik leaving for another business meeting and followed him. Her heart beat faster with every step until she saw what she was most afraid of. Malik met Grace in a secluded place, and Erica caught them together at the moment when they exchanged a kiss. It was a moment that ruined everything. Erica stood in shock, unable to believe that her own mother and her husband could have gone so far. Everything that happened after that was unbearable for every participant in this drama. Everything that happened after that was unbearable for every participant. Erica, in anger and despair, immediately confronted Malik and Grace, demanding an explanation. She screamed, cried, demanded that they tell the truth. Grace was too depressed to find the words right away. Her heart was bursting with guilt, and she couldn't look into her daughter's eyes. Malik, realizing that there was no point in denying it anymore, just stood in silence, not knowing what to say. Everything that could be hidden was revealed. Erica returned home feeling that her world was falling apart. She realized that her marriage to Malik was ruined, and she could not accept that her mother had betrayed her in this way. Erica immediately told her father, George, everything. It was a real shock to him. He had always trusted Grace and was confident in her loyalty. The news that his wife had cheated on him with their own son-in-law was like a lightning bolt. He couldn't believe what had happened, and like Erica, was in a state of deep shock. The family, which until that moment had seemed united and happy, was destroyed overnight. George was furious. He couldn't forgive Grace for her betrayal. He realized that the years they had spent together no longer meant anything. Their marriage, based on trust and support, no longer existed. He demanded that Grace leave their house immediately. To him, she was no longer his wife. Grace, despite all her guilt, tried to explain herself, but George didn't want to hear anything. It was too painful for him, and he could no longer look at her as a life partner. Malik, for his part, also faced the consequences of his actions. His relationship with Erica was ruined forever. She filed for divorce, not wanting to have anything more to do with him. Malik realized that he had lost not only his wife but also his whole life, which they had built together. He had to leave the house, and he was left alone, trying to cope with what he had destroyed. He knew that he had betrayed Erica. He knew that he had destroyed her trust and their life together. He also knew that their marriage could no longer be restored. The revelation of Grace and Malik's affair became the subject of discussion in their social circle. Relatives, friends, and acquaintances condemned their actions. No one could believe that a mother and son-in-law could betray their loved ones in such a way. Grace and Malik have become outcasts in their community. Everyone who knew them turned their backs on them. Their relationship was so forbidden and unacceptable to others that they became the object of ridicule and contempt. Grace has lost not only her family but also the respect of society. She was left alone, isolated from everyone she knew. Her own daughter, Erica, refused to communicate with her. Erica could not forgive her mother for betraying her in the most terrible way. Grace knew that she had ruined not only her marriage, but also her relationship with her daughter, which was most important to her. She tried to find ways to deal with it, but the guilt was too strong. Malik also found himself alone. He had to leave the family he had built with Erica and start a new life. But this new life was full of suffering. He understood that he had destroyed everything he had, and his betrayal had cost him not only his marriage, but also his reputation. He could no longer return to the environment that used to be his home. Grace and Malik, left alone with their feelings and the realization of their mistakes, tried to find a way to move on. They understood that their affair had led to disastrous consequences for everyone. At one point, they even discussed the possibility of continuing their relationship.